Hello, class. This week and probably next week, we're going to be talking about the introduction. And the reason it's taking so long to cover the introduction is because it is, in my view, one of the most important parts of a research study. And it's probably one of the hardest for students to put together and do it well. So I want to spend some time really talking about the introduction, what it's comprised of, what should absolutely be included, and then some issues that students normally face when they're putting together an introduction. So this first lecture video that I'm doing now is just going to talk about some of the components of an introduction and really just kind of give you an overview where I could point to some of the problems that students have when they're putting together an introduction. So there's really five components to an introduction. And if you keep this list next to you as you're putting together your introduction, and make sure that you're hitting each of these points somewhere within the introduction, you should be okay. The problem is students, number one, don't necessarily follow these steps. They'll exclude one, two, or potentially most of these items as they're putting together their introduction. And from my experience, they tend to do a couple things. They tend to overreach when it comes time for their research project. And by overreach, I mean they're just trying to examine too many things. We're going to look at job dissatisfaction and the healthcare issue as a result of transactional leadership, but we're also going to do this and study employees' perceptions as to and it just gets too much. So really, the first problem that I see with students is they're just trying to overreach in the scope of their project. Uh, the second problem is, and this is almost true across the board. I think students want to write as much as they can, and they think the more that I write, the faster this will go, or the better it'll be. And you see a lot of disconnected thoughts and ideas, and the flow of the introduction isn't quite there because paragraphs are thrown in that don't belong, and the debate or the conversation gets thrown off course, and it just becomes this disjointed thing. The key to a good introduction is to really be succinct, to be tight. Don't use excessive words. Don't try to use big academic words if they don't fit. Um, Make sure that your argument is logical and um, it's a flowing argument, that it doesn't break off to the left or break off to the right, somewhere in the middle of it, and it goes from point A to point B to point C to point D, as opposed to going to point A to point B to point 4, then back to point D, and then back to point C, and then over to point 6. It's got to really flow and transition from paragraph to paragraph. So that's hard to do. It's hard to be tight. I would rather see a half-page introduction that is done well than a 6-page introduction that is just all over the board. So it's not often you'll see a half-page introduction. As we go through this, you'll see that it at least needs to be a page or two with all the information that's in there. But again, that's not a lot of time to get across a point. I mean, when we look at this and we see what it is that we're trying to convey with an introduction, there's a lot of information. You have to do a lot of things within the introduction, but you need to do it very succinctly so you keep the audience's attention, you keep them interested, and they know exactly what it is that you're talking about. They're not lost at any point as to what this research project is about. And in the next lecture video, we'll actually go over an introduction, and we'll examine it piece by piece and say, okay, here's where this is, here's where this is, and you see how it flows from here to there. And I think that's the best way to get a feel for the introduction, as opposed to just talking about it. But in this video, we're just here to identify some of the components. So there are 5 components that your book identifies. And the first one is establishing the problem leading to the study. So there needs to be a problem. There needs to be something that you deem as either understudied or something that's wrong or something that you've observed that isn't quite right. And so there's a problem that needs to be addressed. And then you need to really study up on that problem, because the other thing I see a lot is that students will say, well, I'm going to study this. And my first response is almost always, I'm sure that's been studied in great detail already. I'm sure there are volumes of articles and books written about what it is that you're talking about. So you need to really dig down into the issue or problem and see if your contribution is going to add to what is already out there. You don't want to just do something that's already done on a high level. Is there a correlation between cigarette smoking and lung cancer? Well, yes. Like and believe it, in some way, shape, or form, students come to me with issues like that. And I say, well, yeah, that was established, 50 years ago, that there's a relationship between those two things. You need to kind of look deeper at it. And maybe looking now at e-cigarettes or something that's more up to date, more modern, something that hasn't been looked at before. So that's what the problem is, and that's where the problem comes from. Reviewing the literature about the problem. So you're going to dig into it. You're going to really understand where the conversation is. And I use that word a lot, the conversation, and that's exactly what you're doing. You're in a conversation about whatever this issue is, whatever this topic is, and you need to describe that to your audience. You need to say, here is where this part of my problem, here's where the conversation is. Now, there is a section in most research papers called the literature review, where you go and you really dig down deep into the literature. But that's definitely broader. That's way more broad. You're talking about the origins of some of these ideas, and you're critically evaluating some of the research that's out there within a literature review. But in the introduction, you are gonna bring the reader up to speed as to where the conversation is, but not in as great as detail as you would in a literature review. Identifying deficiencies in the literature about the problem is probably one of the biggest headaches students have, because it does require a lot of reading. I'll be completely honest with you. You may read anywhere from 10 to 15 to 20 research articles to really get a good feel as to where things stand. You may be lucky enough to find a literature review, and if there's a topic out there that's been fairly well studied, motivation, for example, or transformational leadership, you will see that there's people conduct literature reviews, which are sometimes 25, 30, 40 pages long, that say, okay, here is the history of transformational leadership, let's say, started here, and it's moved through the years, and here is where we stand currently. Those are great articles to find, because then it really brings you up to speed quickly with just one or two articles that you need to read, and hopefully as you're reading that, something clicks and you say, oh, okay, here's where we are, but I would like to see this done, or my question is this, or my observation has been this, my conversation with my bosses has been about this, so I would like to study that. Targeting the audience. So you really need to know who your audience is too, because the way you're writing this, you want to appeal to your audience. And if they don't think it's a problem, then they're probably not going to read any further or care too much about the article. So, you really want to make sure that you're targeting the people who are going to find interest in what it is that you're doing. If there's a new method out, a new teaching method that's going to improve student scores on tests, you want to structure it in a way that's appealing to that audience, and is going to pique their attention, because at the end of the article they may say, hey, yeah, that teaching method seems like it would do this, so I'm interested, I want to try that. And then identify the purpose of the proposed study. And the problem and the purpose are a little different. The purpose is to examine the relationship between this specific teaching method and student outcomes, or something along those lines. Whereas the problem is, here's what and when we look at the actual example of an introduction in the next lecture, again, I'll highlight some of the stuff where you'll see that, yeah, the purpose stands alone from what the problem is. The problem is almost part of your argument, right? Where you're saying, here's the problem, here's what's been done already, here's what I see as an issue, here's, some of these other things that are going on. You're going to look at some of the literature review, some of the history of it, and then after all that, pretty much towards the end of your introduction, you're going to say, and the purpose of this, why I'm doing this research is to examine specifically this. The introduction is the initial passage of a study, right? So it's going to be the first thing that you're doing. It sets the stage for the project. It creates reader interest. That's critically important. You need to capture the reader's attention and then hold them through that introduction by not drifting off course. The second you drift off course is the second the reader disconnects. So everything needs to flow and just be consistent with the argument that you're going to make. It's okay to erase stuff, just because I know sometimes when you write something, you want to hold on to it and say, I wrote this, I can't erase it. I know it doesn't quite fit, but I'll crowbar it in somewhere else if I have to. The best thing to do is just, if it doesn't fit, just erase it. It might be the most beautiful thing ever written, but if it doesn't fit, it's going to throw the reader off, and it's going to ruin the flow of your paper. It establishes the problem that leads to the study. It places the study within the larger literature. There's conversations going on all across academics, and you want your research paper to fit somewhere in this conversation. That someone may even say, "Hey, look, this person did this. This was in addition to some of the other stuff," and it really helps advance the conversation by reaching out to a specific audience. The research problem itself can come from any number of sources. Personal experiences is one of the biggest ones, and I have over 15 years of managerial experience and leadership experience, and I have troves of these experiences and questions that I have about actions and behaviors and motivations. And when I read something, my mind is always taken back to a specific event, and I say, "Oh yeah, I remember this was happening." That's a personal experience, and how does that fit into the broader context of the literature? There could be a debate going on within the literature. I remember when I first started studying emotional intelligence. There was this big conversation going back and forth between Mayer and Savoy and Daniel Goldman, and what's included, what shouldn't be included, and you're wrong, no, I'm right, and you're wrong, and here's why. And so this debate was going back and forth, and it provided a lot of good literature. And a good example for me, anyway, of someone saying, "Hey, look, you don't have to agree with everything. If somebody comes out with something that says my idea of emotional intelligence is this, and here's why, because I've studied it," and you say, "Well, I've done it too, and I didn't come up with those same conclusions," and it's okay to have that debate, the gaps that need to be addressed in the literature. That's another big one, and you're going to find those. And when we do the example in the next lecture, you'll see it where the gap is almost immediately identified in the literature. Here's what's been done. Here's where I think research is missing. The last thing too, policy debates. There's a lot of debates that go on within local governments, within the federal government, within corporations themselves regarding policy. It's 2019. We're talking about a border wall and some of these other things. That's a policy. That's something that can be debated, whether we need that form of border security. And there's good arguments for, and there's good arguments against. And I think those are, if you could really make a strong argument using the literature either for or against, that makes for a real nice research paper. The last thing I want to talk about here. No, I'm sorry. I think there's another slide after this talking about the different qualitative and quantitative introductions. But this is important. Right now, don't worry. Don't get bogged down in the abstract. You don't even for your assignments and some other things. I know it's probably good practice to write it. When you do your capstone, you're going to need an abstract. But the difference is when you do your capstone, you're going to have results. And if you look at the bottom there, it says themes, statistical results, integrated findings. those are the things that are what people really look for in the abstract, right? It's, you could quickly say the issue and the purpose, and then you're going to say we collect the data from da da da, and here's what the data showed, and the implications of this, the ramifications, what this means to society at large, is really what's in the abstract.